Welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This is podcast number 21, titled The Phantom Menace, How Venice Instigated the Protestant Reformation. It's good to be back for another episode, Phoenician Hunter.
Yes, it is. Good to be back.
Excellent. So let's dive straight into it. I wanted to begin with your reference to a gentleman by the name of Webster Tarpley, who was an American writer and political activist. And what he referred to, as you've mentioned in your article, he referred to what's called the Wars of Religion, which was specifically that the Venetians held interests on both sides of the war between the Jesuits, or the Jesuit rather, dominated Catholics, and the Lutherans, Anglicans, and Calvinists.
Yeah, well, what he's referring to there is the wars that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. And I kept coming across this idea, advanced by Tarpley and others, that Venice instigated the split in Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. And the reasoning was to reduce the influence and power of the Catholic Church across Europe. I wanted to research that further, that claim, and see if there was any truth to it. And yeah, I found enough evidence to confirm his suspicions there. Yeah, and which I lay out, in detail in the article.
You do. But for the benefit of our listeners, perhaps, could you tell us how it led to this?
Yeah, okay. So the story goes that in 1508, this is the beginning of what led up to the war, that Venice wanted to appoint their own bishop rather than going through the formal procedure, which would have been, the cardinals in the papacy, appointing the bishop with the Pope's consent. Venice wanted to appoint their own, and apparently this sparked, the Pope to call upon all Christian nations, on this war to destroy the Phoenician oligarchy. And this war is referred to as the War of the League of Cambrai, which lasted from 1508 to 1516. So those dates are important to our story, and I'll show what transpired throughout that period. To me, that the reason given, the official reason that, Venice wanted to appoint her own bishop, for me, isn't sufficient for all these nations to go and, try and destroy an ally, basically a Catholic nation. I think the real reason, and others and my own research has uncovered, was that they were, especially Rome, were concerned with Venice's growing financial power and also its territorial ambitions, especially in northern Italy. So they considered this a threat. And another thing that Venice had that a lot of other nations were suspicious of were what they referred to as the Council of Ten. And we'll get into that a little bit later, which was basically their secret service agency. Yeah, in this war, Venice pretty much stood alone against nearly every major power in the Western world at the time. So this included the Papal States, the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish Empire. So, that's pretty powerful force to go up against on your own. So.
Yeah, well, look, this is a nice tie-in into the section of your research where you highlight how the Venetians essentially lost everything that they had conquered across, I think it was a period of 800 years. And at this point, they became desperate. So, when you have a monumental loss like this, your back is clearly up against the wall. So my question is, how did they overcome it?
Yeah, I think it was Webster Tarpley again who mentions that the Venetians had lost everything that they had conquered in more than 800 years, was basically their whole history. They lost everything in a short period, in a year. So they were, and all they had left was their base in the lagoons. So they were very desperate. So obviously, I think that the Venetians couldn't defeat their enemies on the battlefield because we need to remember that Venice was never a strong military power. It never had a vast population or vast army. Most of their force was made up of mercenaries, and they were predominantly a naval force anyway, so fleets. So, ground battle for them wasn't their area. But what they were experts in, and this is probably due to the fact that they couldn't have a strong military, was espionage and diplomacy.
Right.
Okay. So that's why they focused on that area and developed that area. And they were so good at that within the first couple of years of this war, not only did they manage to get some of the forces on their side, they also made the other nations fight against each other. So this brings me up to I heard that Jordan Maxwell once mentioned when he was referring to the Venetians. I mean, he always gives little clues, but he doesn't elaborate. Okay,
Sure.
he doesn't elaborate. So that the words Venetian blinds, you know how you got the Venetian
Yeah.
blinds in your
Yeah.
house, right? Was in reference to their secret and covert customs.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
so it makes
Oh,
sense
wow.
when you look into their activities and how they almost gave birth to this secret service organization that we take for granted today,
Right. Okay.
that most nations have, that it sort of originated with them. And that's why he mentioned that. And when he first mentioned it, I didn't really understand what he was saying, but the further I looked into the Venetians, it made more sense. Mm.
Okay. That's actually quite, I wasn't aware of that, that Venetian blinds as a kid growing up. That's what I
Yeah.
knew them as. Wow.
People just
I
peering,
know,
looking
peering through
the smallest gap.
the gossip mongers of the neighbourhood. Look, you just mentioned earlier the Council of Ten, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that. But my understanding is that they were one of the major governing bodies in Venice at the time, and they were essentially in power between, in quite a lengthy period. And correct me if these dates are wrong, but between the early 1300s to the late 1700s, which is often a
Towards
period
the
towards
end
the
of
end,
the,
which
yeah.
is a period referred to as the late period of the Republic of Venice. Can you maybe elaborate?
Yeah, that's correct. Pretty much from when they were instituted, they took control right up until the end of, the life of Venice, the Republic. So the Council of Ten was, the Venetian CIA or MI6, So it was one of the world's first state intelligence organizations, and they were active, right? So they had agents all over Europe, Anatolia, North Africa, and the Middle East. So pretty much the entire, known world at the time, or the areas of influence. And it oversaw Venice's diplomatic and intelligence services. So they're the face to other nations. They're the ones talking on your behalf with, France or the
Mm,
Vatican or whatever it is.
mm,
Also, it managed its military
mm,
and it managed its legal matters. So they were the law enforcers, the judges,
mm.
okay? So, and also they were involved in torture and assassinations. And this is where I think a lot of those other nations said, we need to put a stop to these crazy people here.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Ten, pretty much ruled Venice. They even had the power to remove the Doge if he became too corrupt.
Oh, okay.
So they had the power to remove the head of state, basically, the
Mm-hmm.
leader.
Well, and this goes on to what you've already mentioned in terms of the War of the League of Cambrai earlier and the Protestant Reformation. If I could just maybe enlighten our listeners as to what the War of the League of Cambrai was. It was a major conflict during the Italian Wars, mainly fought in northern Italy, centred on Venice. And my understanding is it was triggered by jealousy and resentment over Venice's growing wealth, land holdings, and
Mm.
the power of the Italian mainland, essentially. So, and further to that, the Protestant Reformation, which began, I think, the following year in 1517 with Martin Luther. And I know you haven't mentioned him yet, but we'll get to that in a moment. Can you just maybe tell us just a little bit more about that part of history?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, the war ends in 1516, and a year later, this is when the Protestant Reformation begins.
Mm,
So within a year. And so, sometimes you just need to look at dates to follow the story of what's going on. So I think during this period that Venice was at war, they were preparing for this what became a counter war in itself, which was the war of of religions.
mm,
So they were preparing for it. This is when they laid their foundations of what would become the Protestant Reformation. So, like I said, although, Venice survived the war, it did show to them that how vulnerable they were to the power of the church, right?
mm.
And its influence on all the other nations. So this is why I think they responded to this threat.
And correct me if I'm wrong, they publicly challenged the Catholic Church authority, essentially. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
they did that with electing their own bishop. That's sort
Mm,
of
mm,
an open, we're going to do things our own way. But see, this is why I believe also that the Protestant Reformation was most likely handled by the Council of Ten, because they would have had the means to carry out that kind of operation. So if you're gonna launch something like that, you'd need an organization like the Council of Ten to do it. So they already had that in place. So
right.
Yeah, and this is also where, I closely follow Edwin Johnson's claims,
Mm,
and one of them is that the Bible was written between the 1400s and the 1500s, all right?
wow.
So this makes perfect sense as well. Otherwise, we are to believe that if we believe the standard historical view that Christian literature and the Catholic Church remained unchallenged. So their literature and their authority
Mm,
remained unchallenged for 1,000 years. So no one said anything. No one challenged the doctrine. No one challenged the Pope. His authority. For 1,000 years, everyone shut up.
mm,
What were people stupid? You know what I mean? It's like
yeah.
history looks upon our ancestors like they were dumb.
Mm,
They're illiterate and stupid. No, I think what happened is that the Bible and the church and the authority is launched, and soon after, this is within I would say within 50 years,
mm,
then there's a counter reformation saying, hang on a minute, who the hell are you? No, you're reading this incorrectly, challenging it. And that's what happens today. Like if someone launches a scientific paper, for instance, right?
mm.
What happens? It gets debated straight away. If
That's
someone
right.
makes some kind of claim, a kind of, a big claim, which will affect a lot of people, it gets challenged straight away. You don't wait 1,000 years. You know what I mean? So we've got to look at these things logically, and this is what I always try and do. So that's why again, it points to Edwin Johnson's claim as being accurate.
Okay, well, look, you highlight in your research, and I want to refer specifically to your article where you write that, between the years 1508 and 1518, Luther, Martin Luther, his name, had what came to be known as his Tower experience. Now, I'm not sure whether you want to go through what the Tower experience is.
You can explain. You need to, I guess, a little bit.
If my understanding is correct, it's referred to, again, for the benefit of our listeners, it marks a moment in his theological development where, from what I understand, he essentially reinterpreted the concept of the righteousness of God as a gift granted through faith rather than a standard of divine judgment, if that makes sense. And as you know, his realization at the time became a cornerstone of what we know as Protestant theology. So in your research, you mentioned that he claims that upon meditation, the Holy Spirit unveiled the scriptures in a different light, thus becoming the inspiration for his breakaway movement.
Exactly. So again, they're looking at the scriptures in a different light. So this is why I'm saying it doesn't take 1,000 years logically thinking about it, people. It doesn't take 1,000 years for one person
That's
to
right.
question. It just doesn't make sense. I know it's difficult for people to grasp that the scriptures are ancient and that to get their mind around the fact that they might not be ancient is really
Right.
hard.
Yeah,
But when you look at it logically, it's the only thing that makes sense.
of
Okay,
course.
so what's interesting about that experience that he had was that historians have found that someone else had written about a similar, very similar experience. And this person was connected with the Venetian oligarchy. It was a Venetian called Gasparo Contorini, right? And he
Okay.
was a very important figure. And as I'll explain, in Venice, he had written, they found letters that he was writing about this way before Luther had written about it. So this is why I think it was the Venetians who came up with it. And then they created Luther, or they, placed this doctrine, this theology on him and said, oh, yeah, he's the cause of it. Because like we said, I think in the last podcast, how these rulers, these merchants, they use these characters to launch their ideas, and be it literature or music. Remember we were speaking about that
Yes, yes.
last week. So this is what's happened here. So it's really the Venetians who are coming up with this questioning the doctrine. I'll get into who he is now. So he was a diplomat, cardinal, and bishop. He advocated, so he was the one who was advocating for dialogue with the Protestants during the Reformation. So he was the voice for the Catholic side, and he
Yeah,
was sort of saying, yeah, let's try and talk it out with these people, right?
sure, sure.
And he's also, so he's the leader of the Reform movement within the Catholic Church.
Mm,
So, and he played a role also in the papal approval of the Jesuits. So
geez.
he's the one, again, a Venetian, who tells the church to, yeah, let these guys in, let these Jesuits be a part of our organization. Now, I'll just touch on them briefly because, the Jesuits is a huge topic and it
Of
needs
course,
its
yeah.
own
Yeah.
dedicated podcast. But
Yeah.
because a lot of people say, oh, the Vatican rules the world, it's the Jesuits and okay, now let me just point something out that they neglect. A lot of Catholic organizations despise the Jesuits and didn't want them in. And a lot of nations actually banned them. They were banned from Portugal, France, Spain.
Mm.
This is all Catholic countries at one point or another. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So they're obviously doing stuff that the
Doesn't
church.
doesn't sit well with the yeah.
Exactly. They didn't prove, right? This
Mm.
is why I think also it might have been the Venetians approved them, so they're almost their own eyes and ears inside the Catholic Church for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that's all I'm going to say on that.
Okay.
But the House of Contarini, again, is very important because they're one of the 12 founding families of the Venetian Republic, okay? And one of the oldest families of the Italian nobility going back to ancient Rome,
Yes.
okay? So this just shows how important his influence is here, and in both sides of the conflict.
Well, it's as a side fact, is an interesting fact that the Contarini family
Mm.
still exists in Brazil. When there was an Italian immigration in the 19th century, they actually, and it's funny, it's interesting that you've said what you've said because when they landed in Brazil, they then maintained their family traditions rather and integrated very well into the Brazilian culture. So they still use the same approach, if that's how you'd like to take it. So what that illustrates to me is that their legacy obviously continues beyond Venice today.
Yeah.
They adapt to new environments, and they, at the same time, they preserve their historical identity.
Yeah, well, if I've written about this before in an article called From Venice to England. So I believe, and what you've said again just makes sense, that the Venetian families, or most of them, moved from Venice to England, and then naturally they would have moved from Venice to America or the Americas.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's
yeah.
where you say, he was in Brazil,
Brazil.
but I'm sure a lot of them moved to North America as well. Don't forget, the Venetians were all over North America when it was founded on behalf of the British Crown. So it was Venetian sailors that were ahead of their vessels there, exploring the New World. So
Okay.
there's the connection. The connection's all over the place. I mean,
Of course.
I've got a few articles on it. So for people who want to look into this further, I've got a few articles on Venice and their connection with England and America.
And I was going to say, we're going to talk about England later on, but I was going to say that for any people listening, you have a dedicated Substack channel at phoenicianhunter.substack.com where you can find these articles. Now, there are quite a few that are based on a free subscription, but again, I encourage people to go for a paid subscription because the sort of deep dive you do, the rabbit holes that you dive into are absolutely amazing. And your research, one article will take you anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks to put together, which is testament to what you say. So let's continue. From your research, you also write that without the aid of the printing press, and we discussed this in our last podcast with the Gutenberg press, it is unclear whether the Reformation would have ever occurred.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the printing press is so vital at this time in history, and it's one of the most important inventions of all time. It changed the world, just like the internet did. If it wasn't for that, they wouldn't have been able to, launch these ideas on a massive scale. And that's what they were doing. And see, this is what I think. I've got this thought that the Bible existed in printing format first, and then they would have had notes, obviously, you've got a draft before you write a book, right? But it wasn't a published book before it was a printed book is what I've got this idea that's what I think's happened there.
Right.
And then what they do is then they write the old ones and say, antedate it and say, look, this is really old.
That's
you know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So because it was the New Testament is the new program for the new age. So it's launched at this time too. It's amazing how the right technology comes at the right time.
Of course, yeah.
Again, here they're using the printing press, and guess what happens? Okay, so this causes the Catholic Church to lose control of all the written materials, because at that time they had control of most of the written materials that's distributed throughout the old Roman Empire and Europe, and also they've got the distribution. You can write something. But if you don't have people to distribute to it, who's going to see it?
No one's going to know about it. Yeah.
It's like us today. If you're going to try and publish something, if you don't have a publishing deal, good luck.
That's right.
It's very difficult. So what the Venetians found was, those controlling printing were able to control the flow of information, right? So it's no different today with, publishing houses, television, and the internet. And although Germany is considered the birthplace of printing, right, it wasn't until the Venetians took it up and developed it further. They made some innovations in the 1500s, and it was Europe's printing and publishing capital. So not many people know that Venice was the printing and publishing capital, right? So this is why I say the Venetians quickly jumped on this invention to control it. Just like an analogy is like the Jewish community did with the television and film industry.
Yes.
Right? There's a good book called, and I think it was written by a Jew, An Empire of Their Own. It's called An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. So, it's not their invention, but they jumped on it really early. They saw the value of it, and they took it for themselves.
And they promoted it better too, obviously for the masses. And following on from that, you mentioned that those who controlled printing at the time controlled the narrative, specifically control of the reach and frequency of information, as you've just explained. You also write in your article, what gave Luther and the rest of the Protestant reformers real clout? And I'll get to who Luther was, because I don't think we've clarified that yet. So what gave Luther and the rest of the Protestant reformers real clout was a publicity and diffusion of their ideas that owed much to the Venetian publishing establishment. And if I can just sidestep for a moment, just to explain who this Martin Luther was. So Martin Luther, he was a German theologian and former Catholic monk who was attributed as triggering what you've referred to earlier as the Protestant Reformation. So he publicly challenged the Catholic Church authority, as we've already said, and kind of shaped the next 200 plus years of European history, including wars, state building, and obviously the redefinition of faith. So based on that, can you tell us a bit about that statement?
Okay. So like I said earlier, Venice became the capital of publishing. So what's interesting is now, at the time, so Venice is a Catholic nation, okay? Why would a Catholic state, and that is friendly to Rome, wish to publish material that will threaten its power? Why would it do that? Well, why would they go ahead and do that if they didn't secretly want this conflict and outcome?
Of course.
Right? So it's like, they're making the fire larger by doing this. What I also found looking into the Venetian printing and publishing industry, I found some interesting facts, all right? So, and I'll go into these in greater detail in the article, but I'll just mention them here briefly.
Of course,
right?
yes.
Because it just shows you the influence of not only printing, but the Venetian printing houses, right? The first translation of the Bible from Latin into Italian was published in Venice. The first complete Bible printed in Greek was printed in Venice. The first rabbinic Bible, which is an edition of the Hebrew Bible, again, the first was printed in Venice. The first complete Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds are printed in Venice.
Wow.
The first Quran in Arabic is printed in Venice.
Whoa.
Okay, so all these three Abrahamic doctrines are printed in Venice for the first time. A reminder, the merchant capital of the world. The merchants are giving you what? These doctrines for the first time. Why? Why? Because they believe in these faiths? Why? No, it's because they represent a program they want you to follow, people. Okay. I always say that the Bible was given to you by merchants. There's a reason for that.
Which goes back to earlier podcasts that we've done on the merchants. Well, can I ask you a question then, based on what you've just said? You mentioned the rabbinic or Hebrew version of the Bible.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting that there was some type of Jewish involvement in the Protestant Reformation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, see, I also believe there was a Jewish hand in, and I believe this is the case. It's not controversial that, it was written by Jewish scholars. I'm talking about the New Testament, okay?
Yes.
So they obviously had a hand in all those, and some say the same with the Quran. But see, I mean, I believe that all these go back to the Avesta, which is, the doctrine of Zoroastrianism, which we've discussed before anyway. Yes. What they've done is they've grabbed bits from here, bits from there, and put them into one, in a different format, basically. There is a specific Jewish involvement in the Protestant Reformation, and this is what bothers me with a lot of researchers, okay? Because, as I mentioned earlier, Tarpley gives a lot of good information about, and he's the one who alerted me to this whole story to begin with,
Mm.
but he leaves out a lot of things that he doesn't feel comfortable with. All right. This is what researchers do. So, if you're of a certain faith or a certain belief, you'll leave out something that's conflicting to that way of believing or thinking,
Of
and
course.
just present the facts that are relevant to you. So he's left out this very important aspect, which is the Jewish aspect. He never goes there. I don't know why. I don't know what his reasons are, but he never point a finger in that direction. My information, mind you, came from a Jewish author himself. So this is a Jewish author telling us what the Jews were up to.
Of
Okay.
course. Yeah.
One of the key aims for the Venetians was to take England away from papal influence. Okay. Now, perhaps they did this knowing that that was going to be their destination eventually. Not
Mm.
sure.
Mm.
Okay. So, because these people plan ahead, right? Hundreds of years. This is important because many people incorrectly believe that England and the city of London are controlled by the Pope and
Mm.
the papacy. All right. Now, this was true up until this point when England was Catholic. The Pope had a lot of influence over the crown there. This is the period that the merchants of London begin to become independent. So with the Protestant Reformation, they break away and they become their own force, these merchants. So the story goes in 1527, King Henry VIII of England wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope refused to accept the king's request. So Henry's advisors and lawyers, what they do is they turn to a Venetian again,
Mm. Mm.
Francesco Giorgi, for assistance. Now, this guy's pretty influential in Venice. So what he does, he's able to find Jewish rabbis in Venice, in the ghettos of Venice. That was one of the places that they were still allowed to be, because at this time, this is important. Jews were banned from England. Okay,
Right.
so there were no Jews in England at this
Mm.
time, and they go there after this. So Francesco Giorgi turns to rabbis in Venice who are willing to support the king's point of view. Now, why rabbis? Why turn to rabbis? Because it's argued that there are no better experts on scripture than the Hebrews themselves.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
wrote it, so they can tell you, they can advise you on the best, way to interpret them. So taking the advice of the rabbis, this would eventually lead to the split from the Catholic Church. So that's what Henry's advisors did. They said, no, we have the authority of God interpreted by the book, in the book by those rabbis. They're the
Yeah.
experts. So we're going to take this point of view. And that's where it led to the split.
But how would this have helped the Jews?
Okay, because we need to understand at this time, the Jews were treated mostly as second-class citizens in many Christian nations.
Mm.
They were excluded from England and Spain at this time. They also weren't allowed to hold positions of influence and power. This episode is the one that changed all that and gave the Jews of Europe a renewed standing and respect, because
Okay.
now you're the experts in our own adopted faith.
Mm.
So you're adopting this faith and they're the experts at it.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Even though many people today try to claim otherwise, that's not the case.
Of course. Yeah.
But okay, people can distort the facts as much as they want for their own personal belief, but the facts are the facts. And
Yep.
this is why a lot of Jewish communities felt more aligned with Protestant nations, that they were more accepted in those countries. And that's why a lot of them then moved to, soon after this, the Protestant wars, they moved to the Dutch states, the Dutch Republic, and then England, and up north. This is when they started leaving the Catholic countries, okay,
No,
and going, and then they played a large part in those nations later on. That's why it's important.
Yeah, and as again a bit of a history lesson for our listeners, and you don't touch on this, but we do know that Jews have lived in England since at least 1066, from what I understand, or what at least history tells us, and that was shortly after the Norman conquest. And again, before we tie things up, as far as Jews in England, in 1290, King Edward I got rid of all the Jews from England, which is now known as the Edict of Expulsion, which lasted for about 350 years, which brings us back to the discussion that you've been talking about. In around 1656, which is the period you've mentioned, they were officially allowed to return under, my understanding, Oliver Cromwell's rule, and he was some influential military leader and later member of parliament at the time.
And again, he was influenced by the Protestant states, and especially the Dutch William of Orange, and they got in that way, and yeah,
Brilliant,
and
brilliant.
yeah.
Which
So
which obviously marks the beginning of what we now know as the modern Jewish communities in England.
yeah, exactly. Just to maybe summarize what we've gone through.
Okay.
I believe, like, so Venice, fearing another attempt by Rome to crush them, or
Yep.
Rome's allies, the Venetians wanted to remove the church's power and influence, understandably. So, and also this event caused the wars of religion that lasted for centuries. So Europe was thrown into, because of this, they were thrown into turmoil for centuries, fighting each other.
Mm,
It devastated Europe. It took a while for them to sort of, come out of it. So it also appears that this agreement, there was an agreement between the Venetian oligarchy and Jewish rabbis, because they needed the Jewish rabbis, they needed their expertise in order to
of
do
course.
this.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was an agreement there, which would, as I said, benefited both parties. And like I said, with the Jews, they were looking at something else. They gave them this new prestige, I guess. This new, they're not looked on anymore as second-class citizens. They're respected wise men.
Mm, mm,
Uh,
mm.
and therefore, Venice was able to weaken the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, across Europe, and the Jews would be free to attain influential positions, right, in Christian
Mm,
nations,
mm.
especially politics and commerce.
Well, look, that's again been another great discussion, a closer look at the Venetians and just how deeply they shaped the world around us. I've found this absolutely fascinating. To me, this is the real story. It's the version that doesn't always make it into the mainstream textbooks, but absolutely should. Nevertheless, I encourage listeners who are on this podcast to access your articles on your Substack channel. As I said, phoenicianhunter.substack.com. There are a great selection of them that fall under the free subscription. So thanks again for your insights, Phoenician Hunter.
No problem. Thanks for your time.
It's been great. And for everyone else out there, remember to subscribe to both Phoenician Hunter's Substack channel and our YouTube podcast channel, which is at On Air Podcast 2025, all hyphenated, to listen to at least the last 20 podcasts that we've done, which are based, the foundation is based around Phoenician Hunter's research. And remember, our YouTube podcasts are absolutely free. So until next time, stay well.